So I want to thank everyone for joining us. I'm very excited today. Katherine and I met virtually through this pandemic, and I was quite impressed with Katherine's practice. So I'd like Katherine to take a moment and introduce yourself, and if you would introduce yourself, let people know who you are,
Sure.
what you do.
Yeah, I am Katherine Miller. I am the founder of the Miller Law Group. I am also a director at the Center for Understanding and Conflict and host of the radio show and podcast Divorce Dialogues. I've been a matrimonial attorney in New York, excuse me, in New York City and Westchester County for over 30 years. I have to stop announcing that to people. And I'm, Jay, excited to be here today with you and to see if we can talk through some of these difficult issues.
Thank you, Katherine. And for those of you who don't know me, my name is Jay Mota. I'm a certified financial planner. I've been a financial planner now for over 20 years myself. I have an office here in New Jersey, New York, and in Chicago area. And I work comprehensive with my clients. And you know, having myself been divorced, one of the things that appealed to me with Katherine is the nature in which she works as an attorney. How helpful she is to help facilitate, you know, a peaceful separation. And I think that is something very unique and something that struck me, and which is why I wanted to work with you, Katherine, and do this. You know, a lot of concerns about divorce, right? So when I speak with clients, and it's unfortunate being in this business as long as I have, when I get the phone call from clients that say, "Hey, Jay, you know, I got some bad news. You know, we're getting separated, we're getting divorced." You know, it's always heartbreaking to me because you build a relationship with these clients, right? But it's nothing in comparison to what they're going through in their own worlds, and the questions that they have and the concerns that they have. And I think so many people feel like, you know, can I even get a divorce, and how do I go about getting a divorce, and the nightmare stories that we hear. So, you know, Katherine, you work with a lot of people who obviously are facing divorce, being your practice. You know, what are some of the initial stages that you find with your clients in going through a divorce or getting a divorce, and maybe some of the mistakes that are made early on?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very big question, Jay, but let me see what I can do with it.
I got to start off big.
So I think that, you know, obviously the first decision people have to make is that this is something they want to do. And we get a lot of calls in the office, you know, with people wondering if my marriage is really bad enough to call it quits, right? And that's a very personal decision. And of course, it involves your own feelings, your family situation, your children, your living situation, your money, your extended family, your community. And that isn't to say that the answer to that is no, you should stick it out. Because, you know, for me, because I'm also divorced, and to be, I don't want to go too lengthy on about myself, but really when in the beginning of my career for about 12 years, I worked as a divorce litigator. And I also did a lot of child welfare litigation. And it really seemed to me that after I got divorced myself, that there just had to be a better way. And the rest of my career has been about trying to help families make a transition that makes sense to them based on their own sense of their reality and their situation, and make the transition with dignity. And so again, the first question is a deep personal decision. Is this right for me? Now, maybe you are not in the position of making that decision because your spouse has made that decision, in which case you're thrown into it, like it or not, and you have to deal with it. And we often say in our field that people are never in the same place at the same time in terms of the emotional readiness being on the recovery, the road to recovery. People are at a different place, and one of the problems that comes up in the negotiation is really managing that difference. But once the decision has been made that we're going to divorce, then the most important decision, that might be the most important decision that you will make in the entire divorce process after deciding to divorce, is how are you going to do that? How are you going to make the decisions that need to be made between the decision to divorce and actually divorced. And let me just say that statistically speaking, very few people actually go to trial, meaning very few people who decide to divorce actually have a judge make a decision after a trial. It's in New York State, 97% of people who are getting divorced resolve it themselves before they get to a trial. Nationwide, that statistic is 95%, and I think that's what it is in New Jersey, but don't quote me on that. And so statistically speaking, and here we are these days thinking a lot about the efficiency and efficacy of COVID vaccines, right? And so the likelihood of actually going to trial is less than the likelihood of getting COVID after any of these vaccines. So it's pretty small. And so then the question is not whether or not you're going to settle, it's how. And so are you going to try to work it out yourselves? That's a possibility. It's extremely hard to do when you've been married for more than a couple of years, children and assets are involved. And it's not something that I tried to do when I was getting divorced. And remember that I'm a divorce attorney. And you're on the other end of the spectrum is sort of lawyering up, right? So what people think of the war of the roses and heading towards litigation, even though all good attorneys will try to settle along the way. So, and in between those two options are two other possibilities. One is mediation, and mediation, the people work with a neutral mediator to facilitate the conversation. Then the mediator is not a decider. So the parties, the couple are the deciders, but the mediator facilitates that discussion, both in helping them identify what needs to be resolved, gather the information that they need to have in order to make decisions, and talk to them about what's important and work through that process toward resolution. And the other is collaborative law, where both people have attorneys and but the attorneys are disqualified from litigating. So there's no threat of going to court. No attorney is thinking, well, you know what, I know what I'm going to do. I'll just file a motion or something like that and take this away from the power of the couple to make these decisions about themselves, their children, and their finances themselves.
Yeah, I know that, just from the legal perspective and the fear and the uncertainty of the process and how it happens is one overwhelming thing. I'll say that from a financial component, a lot of the clients, the question they ask me is, can I afford to do this, right? And taking in the financial considerations, because married couples generally make financial goals together. They buy a house together, they raise children together, they plan their retirement together, they buy boats together. I mean, everything is done for the most part together. And so I know that from a financial, you speaking to the legal aspects of it and how they can work things out and the procedural part, financially separating finances can be very, very difficult. And, I think that the more traditional role back in the day, when we first started, at least when I first started, you had more people that were like single income, like the traditional home. Like we're talking about maybe even like 15, 20 years ago, where the mom probably stayed home more often, but now you have dual incomes and dual retirement, so it's a little bit different. But how you separate that and how you set in that retirement is I know, a big concern. And, there's never a good time for any crisis in anyone's life, and that's what divorce is, right? It's a crisis. And so I think that financially speaking, the advice that I give my clients is that you always have to be prepared for a crisis. You never know what that crisis is going to be. Is it going to be a COVID pandemic that's going to put us in, lockdown and restrict our ability to do things as we normally do, and maybe even earn income, and people are on unemployment, and so many businesses going out of business and planning for that. But divorce is a crisis as well, right? It's a crisis for the couple. It's a crisis for the children. But those are one of those financial things that have to be planned for. And so, when you're splitting up the bills or you're splitting up financial responsibility, it can be really challenging. And so I think the communication is very important, just as much as it is when you decide, do we go through mediation? Are we going to work this out? Are we going to work out the finances and what's reasonable and who gets what responsibility? Would you like to add anything to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot to think of there, Jay. And I think for your clients who are already working with a financial plan, that's a huge first step to making a plan for people living separately than living together. But I think when you think about, can I afford to get divorced? There are a couple of things to think about. One is, what are the legal fees going to be?
Right.
If you think about another kind of crisis, like a medical crisis, you're thinking about, obviously you're thinking about getting better, or for your family member, loved one to get better, but you're also thinking about how much it's going to cost and how much are the best doctor is going to cost and all of that sort of stuff. But then sort of go on, assuming you get through it okay, which is a huge assumption. Then on the other side, you're left to sort of like with what you've got left. So one thing to think about here is that you're going to have legal fees and possibly other professional fees that are involved. And then on the other side, you're going to divide up, and maybe you'll have half of what you had before of what's left over. So I think there's two things to think about.
Yeah.
I don't think that people should make a decision as to what the best how is, like I was saying earlier, based solely on the money of which each one of these things cost. You should make a decision based on what's the best value for you, and that's something we could talk about later. But then I think, first of all, it's really helpful to have a plan and to work with professionals, divorce professionals or financial planning professionals who can help you think about what the plan is and what it's going to cost. Most of our clients are not able to live after divorce exactly the same as they had before, at least at first. Those first 3 to 5 years afterwards are the hardest before things sort of start to kind of rebound and it looks a little bit more like that. Again, it's not necessarily a reason not to get divorced. And in fact, it's not. I mean, but to make what I'm saying about making a plan is it's really helpful to work with someone who can help you think about what's most important to you. And you may very well not have to compromise what's most important to you. I think when we were preparing for this webinar, Jay, I told you a story about a couple I had in mediation years ago, and they were making it work, barely making it work, living together, but there was no way they could keep them. And this was Mr. and Mrs. Bickerfest. I mean, they were arguing all the time, and it was really difficult for them to live together. And I asked them to go and do an analysis of how they were spending their money. And, other people might call that budget. I don't love the term budget because it sounds like diet. It means, we can't have as much. And I didn't mean that. I just wanted them to measure how they were spending their money. And one of them came back to me and said, oh my God, I'm spending $180 a month at Starbucks. And I could just bring my coffee from home and save $180. And this was, this wasn't going to make it the difference, but there were areas in their lives where they were making choices. And this is true for all of us. How much money do we spend that just sort of slips through our fingers because we needed a coffee when we really didn't need a coffee? But if that's the thing that's most important, great, then you'll keep your Starbucks habit and something else will give. But I guarantee you, for most of our clients, there are things that they wouldn't mind letting go of so much, and in order to preserve the things that are most important. And the biggest thing, and this is something that you, I think, help people with so much, is to really focus on what those important things are. What are those goals? And probably you can still work toward them.
Yeah, and that's true for whether you're going divorce or you're not going divorce. I tell my clients all the time, you have to have a plan in place. If you don't know where you are today, you're not going to be able to tell where you're going to be in the future. And so, building.
Well, let me just interrupt you there, because let's say you have a map. You can't get there if you don't know where you are.
Exactly.
Right. And so it just doesn't work that way. Yeah. And so I think that's really scary for people sometimes. I'm sorry for interrupting.
No, that's okay. But also, not knowing, look, we all didn't get where we are today, right? So I remember the days where I was living paycheck to paycheck and things were very, very tight. And I remember just opening my bank account it gave me anxiety, because I was like, oh my God, I don't want to see how little money I have, right? Because that, we all go through that at some point in our lives. I mean, I think very few of us are fortunate to, to be very well off. I think we work and we make an income. But, with that being said, half of the stress and anxiety, I think, going through separation or going through a family change is not knowing, right? The unknown. And I think that from a financial perspective anyway, having a good idea of where you stand financially and what your potential is to reach your goals is going to give you more confidence and less anxiety. So that if you're, brought to a situation where either you're bringing the divorce or you are the one responding to a divorce, you know, it's not going to be easy, but at least you know where you stand and you're not trying to play catch up, right?
Yeah.
And one of the things I think that, you know, is important is at all times that everybody should have, you know, some kind of reserve for a crisis. So one of the things I advise all my clients to do is, you know, you should have a money reserve set up to be able to afford 3 to 6 months of your living expenses. So this way, if you are surprised by a divorce or you're planning a divorce, you know you have that money in your, you know, in your bank account that you can survive 3 to 6 months. And you know, you're not going to be like, well, you know, we're forced to live in the same house because, you know, we can't afford 2 separate households, or, you know, trying to, you know, you never want to make a decision when you're in crisis, right? Like when you're going through it, it's tough to make financial decisions. So I'd like to ask you, like, some of the concerns that your clients bring to you from a financial perspective. We can like reverse the roles here. Like, what are some things that your clients come to you with concerns about financially?
Well, a lot of them are lifestyle questions, Jay. You know, will I be able to stay living in my house?
Mm-hmm.
You know, and will I be able to keep driving my car? And, you know, will I be able to afford the things that I need on a day-to-day basis? That, you know, that's a big concern that people have.
Yeah. And there's really, you know, I think it depends on the lifestyle that you create together and who's responsible for what income, right? And if you decided to have, I know my wife and I'm married, you know, we have a house joint account. We each have our own personal savings account, you know, and so we have multiple accounts for multiple purposes. But in order to maintain that lifestyle, you know, it depends on what your lifestyle was and how you saved your money beforehand, right? I think it's a huge concern. It's a natural concern. And there really is no answer to it, right? But other than to be prepared, right? Other than to be prepared and to make sure that you're being financially responsible. Now, I guess, I don't know if anybody on today's webinar has a question I'd like to ask of Katherine and I. We want to make this as interactive as possible. Certainly, you know, Katherine and I could probably talk for hours about, you know, how this affects individuals, both from a legal and a financial standpoint. But, you know, if anybody wants to ask a question, you know, you can just unmute yourself or you can type it in the chat. And feel free to ask any question from a legal perspective or financial perspective. You know, if it's something that we can't answer in a public forum, then we can definitely, you know, make arrangements for us to get you an answer individually. But if anybody has any questions, please feel free to ask.
You know, while we wait to see if anybody has a question or is brave enough to ask it, because I'm sure there are questions out there. I want to, you know, another thing that people often ask, Jay, and I don't know if you have a comment about this, is about life insurance.
Yeah.
You know, and planning for either for the death of their ex-spouse, soon to be ex-spouse, or themselves, and protecting their children. And what do you tell people about that?
Yeah, that's wow. That's, you know, that's a great question. And so, you know, life insurance, unfortunately, is one of those things that people generally only come to me about when something happens, right? Unfortunately, it's not something that very many people are proactive about. But you know, when you're going through a divorce, there are some things to be considered. Number one, you know, the courts, I understand, sometimes are going to require, you know, some kind of life insurance to ensure child support or alimony payments. So I do get questions regarding that. But, you know, if you're trying to do it absent of the courts or do it through an amicable method, you know, I think that if you're getting a divorce and you require or need some financial assistance from your ex-spouse, you know, unfortunately, if they're no longer here, that's going to be very hard for them to achieve. But unfortunately, again, your needs are not going to go away. So I think it's important to consider that, even if you do it for a short term. If you have young children, if you know, your alimony payments or anything like that, whether you're paying it or you're receiving it, I think it's important that there be an insurance policy available so that, God forbid, something happens to that individual, the quality of life and the children don't suffer. So, there are many different types of life insurance policies. I know it can be very confusing, but yeah, life insurance is a big part of any financial plan or any family plan for that matter. And the earlier you get it, the better off you are. Because if you decide or something like this happens and you're older or maybe not as healthy, it may not be an alternative. It may not be a method that you can use. And then, you have to worry about the fact that if this person passes away, then that support is gone forever. And there's no insurance because they didn't qualify or they couldn't afford it. So yeah, life insurance is very important. I would say mostly for the children's sake. I used to tell clients this way, right? Like, I used to draw a box, and in one quadrant was the family, the next quadrant was the house, the next quadrant was the school, and the next quadrant was the schoolhouse friends, right? The children's friends. And so the impact, and I used to volunteer at a nonprofit called Comfort Zone, and children who lose parents, whether they're divorced or married, they definitely have a unique situation because many children don't have that in common, right? I mean, I understand that parents pass away, and there are kids that lose parents, but in their world, right, it's not like they don't go to school and other kids might be in that same situation, so they feel isolated. But with life insurance, and the reason why I'm going here is that life insurance helps to maintain, we can't keep mom and dad around, or the spouses around. We can't, we can't do that. But, we can make sure the child stays in the same house. We can make sure the child goes to the same school and is able to keep the same friends. And I think that planning for divorce financially is kind of like along with that as well, because you really don't want to disrupt the children's lives, right? And that's I mean, they're the innocent ones in this, and that's the hard part about this. But without life insurance, if something happens to one of the parents, divorced or not, that's definitely going to have an impact on the children's lives. So I think it's important, whether divorcing or not, to have a life insurance policy.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. Another thing that we think of a lot, sometimes when people get married when their kids are really young, and we're putting into place a support payment between the parents that's going to last a long time. And one thing that we really we try to get for our clients who are receiving the child support is a cost of living adjustment. Because what seems like a lot of money today might not seem like a lot of money in 10 years. And what do you think about that from a financial planning perspective?
Yeah, again, I'll tell you this much. The irony is that I know we're talking about divorce here, right? But like, I ask couples all the time who have been married for 10 or 15 years, 20 years, do you know what each other's retirement goals are? And so few adults and married couples speak about one another's goals, right? And let's not kid ourselves. I mean, you and I believe, know that money issues are one of the largest catapult to destruction of marriages, right? Because people argue about money or they don't agree with money, and so it creates that friction and all kinds of things, and mistrust happen there. So, I think that when you're getting married or you're getting a divorce, I think at all times you need to know where you stand, right? I think you need to know that, hey, because look, it may not be a divorce, but it could be a death, right? What happens if my spouse dies? If my spouse dies, how am I going to retire, right? So it's that same mentality. I mean, they're not dying, but you're getting a divorce. They're still not going to be there in your life to help facilitate that retirement. So I think it's only responsible when, you think about what your personal goals are and then speak about that with your spouse. And if that spouse is no longer in the picture, you're still able to go with your goals. And altering the quality of life, I mean, that's just, again, it's just a matter of planning. But I think knowing where you are and what you're able to do and communicating that and having a plan early on is going to help offset that. But there are no guarantees in life. But I certainly think that waiting for something to happen, waiting for something to change, waiting for a situation to improve to start planning is too late, because before you know it, something may come up and it's lost. So I think a lot of what we're saying is to be proactive. It doesn't have to be about divorce, but it's about being proactive. and the earlier you start. And I think that when you're going through a divorce specifically, and you start thinking about divorce, you need to start thinking about in your mind, hey, what am I have to separate? And, working with a financial planner to identify what your living needs are and what your retirement needs are and how you're going to fill in those gaps, right? Do you modify your expectations or do you modify your actions? But something's got to be modified, unless, you're very fortunate where, you just have to now focus on one side of the house versus both sides of the house.
So speaking of the house, Jay, how do you think about this as a financial person about keeping the house?
Yeah.
A lot of people think I need to hold on to the house for stability for my kids or stability for myself, but sometimes it's super expensive.
Yeah.
And from a financial perspective, it might be better, and I'm not saying that it is better, but because you're balancing the emotions of wanting to hold on to something that feels like a stable place versus the financial reality. It doesn't necessarily mean you have to live in a cardboard box by the curb. I'm not saying that, but to move into something that is more affordable, or if it's even possible, because sometimes staying where you are is the least expensive option to keep your kids in the school district or whatever it is that you're thinking about. So what are the things that you ask people to think about when they're thinking about the cost of their home and where they should live?
I think that a big answer to this question, kind of is what your law firm appealed to me, is that the more communication there is, right, between a couple in getting separated, I think that these types of questions can be answered easier, because when you have two people that are bitter or upset with one another and they can't get beyond the emotions with making decisions, I think that's where bad decisions are made, right? So I think that the first part is to find someone like yourself that can help keep things on top of the table and say, look, these are the facts and let's focus on this and let's make the right decision. So from a financial perspective, yeah, I mean, we look at, well, what's the cost of selling versus renting, and what are your costs now? And, other factors, taxation, education, all of these things that you mentioned. Clients ask me all the time, should I sell? Should I buy? Is it now the right time? I mean, it's always as opposed to what, because there's not like a blanketed answer. It's like, well, what are your options? Well, my options are to rent. Okay. How much are you paying in mortgage? Are you going to continue to pay for the mortgage? Right. I think the bigger issue is when there's equity in the house and one partner needs to buy out the other partner. I think that is, I think that's the bigger issue, when there's equity and a partner has to come up with so much money to buy out the other partner. And that's where the challenge is of keeping the house, right? If you own a house that's worth $500,000 and there's a note for $200,000, there's $300,000 in equity, right? So,
Jay, I think you should slow down and explain what all that stuff is, because you're using, financial terms, and I've had people not really understand what the note means and what against the equity. So
yeah.
I think it would be really helpful if you just slow down and
Sure.
talk through what all of that actually means.
Yeah, no, and I apologize for that, and I appreciate you giving me the opportunity to restate. So if you own a home, and assuming the home is worth $500,000, and your mortgage on that home is just $200,000, that means that the $300,000 difference is what they call equity, right? That's really what your net worth is built on, right? That's what your value is 300,000. Because if you sold the house for 500, you would pay off the bank 200, you keep 300,000. So when couples are going through a divorce, I think the bigger challenge is that when there is that, say, $300,000 in equity, and one wants to stay in the house, and all for good reasons, for the children, etc. Well, how does that other divorcing partner buy out that other half? So, and that's where the big challenge comes into play, is finding the money. So if I get divorced from my wife and she keeps the house, well, now, how does she pay me, say, half of the $300,000, $150,000 that the equity that exists? And so now she's got to come out with that money. So she may need to refinance the house to give me money. So these are all considerations that we look at when clients ask me about keeping the house or selling the house is, you know, what are your options and as opposed to what? Can you refinance? Is your credit strong enough? Is your income strong enough to refinance? And if you refinance, you know, can you afford the new mortgage? You know, so I think that's the bigger question is as opposed to what, you know, how much is it going to cost to rent? You know, I know that when I bought a house years ago, I was looking to rent first in a new community, and the rent was like $3,000 a month. And I was like, well, it's going to cost me $10,000 to move into a rental, pay $3,000 a month. To me, didn't make sense when I can buy a house, put a little bit more money down, but now pay $3,000 to a mortgage. But not everybody can do that, right? And sometimes it's cheaper to rent. I have friends of mine that don't want to deal with appliances breaking down and maintenance on a house. And so they prefer to rent, but it's to each their own. But I think that you just have to look at what the options are and always look at what the alternatives are and decide what makes better sense for you. But there's no blanket answer for that, unfortunately.
Yeah, I think it's a tough question, and I think it's really hard to, especially if you're not the one who's choosing the divorce, to feel really disrupted, and it's scary and it's angry making, and yet it's really smart to dust off your calculator and look at what the numbers really are and what the options. You know, on the other hand, you know, I have clients living in a house they own, and other than freeing up the equity, and I'm not, you know, that's not nothing sometimes, you know, in our areas, but it's actually cheaper to live on a cash flow basis, meaning month to month. It's less money in and, you know, less money out, and the you know, the ability to deduct the mortgage interest, and, you know, at times, sometimes even some of the real estate taxes, depending on where we are, who's in the White House. You know, there sometimes are some real advantages. And so really kind of looking at it with a calculator and not with your emotions. Not to say that the emotions shouldn't win, but just to know. It's just information, right? It's really helpful. And what else is out there?
I just like to, I'm going to ask you a question before I do. I just want to say that from a financial perspective, for those of you that are on the call today, I don't know where you are in the process, whether you're in the thinking about it process, if you're in the negotiation process, or maybe you're already divorced. But I think that, you know, if those of you that are looking to potentially be divorced or might be getting a divorce, I think that the most important thing you can do from a financial right now is to look at a cash flow analysis. And a cash flow analysis basically is going to tell you how much income you have coming in and how much income going out, right? I think that's the most important thing that you can do, because that's going to help you to understand your finances. And, you know, when you talked about the story earlier about the Starbucks and cutting down on the Starbucks, you know, when you do a cash flow analysis, you're analyzing where you're spending your money. And you may not think you can afford certain things, but by looking at the cash flow analysis and building a budget, you'll determine where your money is going. You'll determine how you can tighten that up. But understanding your cash flow and how that cash flow is working for you on a monthly basis is definitely going to give you a better idea of what you can and can't do as you proceed. And if you're already divorced or in the process, there's nothing wrong with stopping now and doing that. I think it's ultimately important that you have a cash flow analysis done, coupled with a budget, right? And then the budget's going to say, okay, well, these are now my new expenses. These are my new incomes. This is what I'm going to spend my money on. And now I know what I can and can't afford going forward. And the last thing is a net worth statement, which basically is going to help you list out all of your assets, all of your debts, and tell you what your net worth is. And I think from a divorcing perspective, it's important to list out all of your assets and understand what the value of those assets are. You have homes, maybe 2 homes, maybe a couple of cars, a boat, you know, some property, jewelry. You know, that racks up pretty quickly, but understanding what those assets are and what the actual value of those assets, I think would help any couple to determine, you know, maybe, and even some, you know, I hate to say bargaining, but like say, well, you're going to get this and I'm going to get this and the value of it is equal. So it's equal separate. So I think from a financial perspective that, you know, when someone is looking into, I think those are the three top things that need to be done immediately, which is a cash flow analysis, budget, and a net worth statement. Those three things are going to give you a lot of information that you may not have in an organized way. If you're going through the process and you haven't done that, no time better than now to do it. But no matter what, everybody from a prudent financial position should have those statements. So I'd like to pose to you, and I see we have a question coming in, but I'd like to pose the question to you. Like, what is your recommendation for those people who are now in the process of, you know what, I may be thinking about a divorce, to where should they be? Like right now, if they're on the phone, I'm going through this divorce, what advice can I get? And I'm divorced, what should I know from a legal perspective that may be helpful?
Well, so those are a bunch of different questions. I completely agree with you about getting a budget, a cash flow analysis, and really understanding where things are. But I think you also have to count what the assets are.
Mm-hmm.
And so, you know, sometimes the cash flow could be increased by a different allocation of the assets, right? So maybe you sell your house and invest those assets, and that brings in a little bit more money. Maybe somebody goes to work. So I think measuring what it is that's happening now, and then thinking about that's first, because it's really hard to do these things all at the same time. So first, just get a snapshot of your current reality, and then think about how things might change, right? How might you increase income, right? Could there be a change in job? Could somebody who's not working start working? When, not saying that that has to happen this weekend, but when might that happen? You know, when children are in school full time, or something like that. When would people be retiring and income reducing? What about Social Security? What about the investment of assets, or the sale of a home, or moving an asset, or the sale of a business? You know, these are things, you know, when is that likely to happen? How are things likely to change over time? How can we increase income, and how can we reduce expenses? So those are, I think the thing that stops people from doing that analysis of the situation is shame. You know, oh, we shouldn't be spending so much money on eating out. We shouldn't be spending this much money on clothes. Like, this is a judgment-free exercise. It's just measuring what is. And I just want to throw one thing in. I also had a couple in mediation years ago who went all the way practically to divorce before I realized that the thing they were fighting about was money, and that they had enough money to do what they both wanted to do if they had planned it better. So instead of getting divorced, what we just did was a budget, and they're still married because, you know, they had enough money to do it, but you know, she didn't think life was worth living if you didn't go to the occasional concert, and he was just like, we need to plan for retirement, and I'm like, you know what, you could do both if you weren't so in competition about it all the time. And so maybe if you're listening to this webinar and you're arguing with your spouse about money, maybe you don't need to get divorced. Maybe you just need to go see Jay or somebody like him and see if you kind of work out those things. You know, I think that, and then just to answer the question with regard to if you're in the divorce process at any phase, the most important thing that you can do is really do some work on what's most important to you. It's so much more important to focus on yourself and your values and what's important to you as you see it than to be in reaction to the other. And do not let the other person frame the conversation about what's important to them, or the law, or any other BS. Focus on yourself. You know, the living well is the best revenge. And so if you can really get what's most important and focus on yourself, then you will have a much better result than if you let your lawyer, the court, your soon-to-be ex-spouse, or anything else dictate it for you.
Yeah, that's you know, that's a great intro to the question that came in. The question is, so my spouse wants a divorce. How do I persuade my spouse to look for mediation, or, you know, a collaborative process? You know, how do I convince my spouse that, hey, I want to work this out amicably and not like go at each other's throats?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. I congratulate you for thinking about mediation or collaborative as well. And I can't really answer the question specifically,
Right.
to your situation without knowing. But I think that it's often useful to give your spouse material to read
Mm.
about it. So this isn't coming from you. This isn't an argument that you're going to have. But if you can find something that gives them the opportunity to hear from experts why this is beneficial. I wrote a book called The New Yorker's Guide to Collaborative Divorce, really for that reason, to help people, read about what it is from someone other than their spouse. But there are a lot of other resources out there that if you send me an email, I'd be happy to send you some that you could share, and also websites about mediation and about collaborative law, and why mental health professionals who are thinking about the best interest of children and also the mental health of ex-spouses, about how disruptive and destructive the litigation process can be. I think that can be really quite persuasive.
No, that's great. I think that's the hardest part, is when you're caught off guard with these things, right? And so, I mean, I think it's also more difficult that, to get the other person to agree with you on anything when the divorce isn't that part. So, when you get to that point, it's just, I think emotions are difficult, and they're natural. So,
Yeah, and let me just can I just add something to that
yeah,
too?
please, please.
So sometimes people feel that their spouses have a Svengali-like power over the world, right? And sometimes people feel that their spouses, often their husbands, really wield so much power in the world that they would never be able to negotiate with them. Sometimes I hear, my spouse negotiates for a living, and so he's a powerful negotiator. How will I ever deal with that in a mediation? So if that's how you feel, then mediation probably isn't the right process. Or if that's how your spouse feels, then mediation might not be the right process for you. But that doesn't mean you have to go to litigation, right? That's where, I mean, there are a couple of things you could do. One, you could bring attorneys to the mediation so that your spouse would feel that she or he had support, had someone had their back in the mediation. Or you could just do collaborative process, and the collaborative process is usually an interdisciplinary process where we work not just with lawyers, but with mental health professionals to deal with the dynamic issues, which is obviously a big thing in a divorce, and a financial professional who can deal with financial issues. So it just feels more supportive. These are ways that you can stay out of court, have the mediative idea of coming to a resolution that makes sense for you and your family, and not waste money needlessly on really useless arguing.
Yeah. No, thank you. And I want to thank that person for asking the question. Please, if anybody else has any questions regarding anything that we talked about today, or any questions that maybe we didn't address, if you'd like more information on it, please don't be shy. I mean, your question, if you text it into the chat, comes directly to me. It's a private. So, no one will know you're asking if that's what you're worried about. But, I just want to say, as we come up on close to an hour here, it's an honor to work with you, Katherine. And again, it's not common that you find people in our level of business and in a professional role that still care about what truly happens with the clients. I think that, it's unsaid, but I think that people just become complacent and procedural. And it's, this is the world to our clients, but to, some people, they treat it like this is just another day at the office. And, not understanding that and being compassionate, I think, is a huge, stressor in itself, on top of all the other stressors. So again, one of the reasons why I wanted to partner with you on this, and one of the reasons why I admire your practice so much, is the compassion you put into your business and the work that you do to help people feel human and still go through this process and not feel like, the fear or the uncertainty or the embarrassment and all the other things, and bewilderment and all these other things that we experience when we go through these types of things. So I just want to thank you first and foremost for joining us today, and allowing me to do this with you. For our many conversations, I look forward to hopefully not many people getting divorced, but it's going to happen. So I look forward to, working with you and seeing those people do so successfully. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Jay. And at risk of sounding like the Mutual Self-Appreciation Club, I really appreciate your caring for your clients and your dedication to education around financial issues. I think really speaks to your good intent and the caring that you have for the people you work with.
Yeah, thank you. So I think if we don't have anyone willing to ask any questions, we had the 1 or 2 questions that came up, but if no one else has any other questions, we want to thank everybody for joining this educational series that Katherine and I discussed. We hope that you found value in it. Katherine, why don't you please give everyone a contact method for you, whether it be email, by
Sure.
phone?
Yeah, absolutely. Our website, which is actually has a ton of information, is westchesterfamilylaw.com, westchesterfamilylaw.com. You can learn about our podcast at divorcedialogues.com, where I've been interviewing for 7 years various experts on all sorts of things related to divorce, pre-divorce, post-divorce. I just did an episode on dating after divorce. So there's all kinds of stuff there that's also really interesting. Or just give us a call in the office, and the number is 914-738-7765, 914-738-7765.
That's great. And for my contact, everyone, you can email me. You can reach me at Jay, which is my name, jay.mota at prudential.com. Prudential as in the company.com. Whatever the scenario is, wherever you are in the process, don't go at it alone. You have a friend and me and Katherine, and if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask. So with that, I wish everyone stay safe. Beautiful weather out for a change here in the Northeast. So enjoy the fresh air, and hopefully we'll see you soon. Thank you.
Be well.
Bye-bye.